Hello, everybody, and welcome to Narativ. We are beginning to pull ourselves together here, I think, after a couple of days of denial, or call it what you will. But one good way of doing this is to talk to Carl Allen, who's a terrific pollster and analyst and the author of the book, The Polls Weren't Wrong. He's here today to help us find our way to normalcy if we can. First thing, Carl, how are you doing? It's been a whirlwind of a week.
It has. I took about 24 hours off of social media to collect myself before I looked at any numbers and things like that. And the tough part is, early in the night when we saw numbers coming in from Georgia and North Carolina, we saw the direction things were going, not promising. And hopefully that we had all mentally prepared for what we knew was going to be a close election. It's just really not the outcome that I think most of us were hoping for.
No, I think we were all buying the Kool-Aid. If it was just Kool-Aid, there was lots of data to support it, that there was just so much enthusiasm for the campaign. And she seemed to be bringing in bigger crowds than him, certainly more interest in her than him. And overall, the message seemed fresher and newer and more relevant to people. When you really look at the final dynamic here, a lot of people did not find that the message the Democrats resonated with voters. My reaction initially, because of what we've been through with them so much, is they cheated. They found a way through this. I still think there's a lot of Russian interference in the election process, from Elon Musk into what happened on election day with those bomb threats and what have you. But having said that, the results are the results, and influenced by Russian propaganda or not, this is the way Americans voted. Is that your perception, that there was nothing in the numbers that reveal any cheating, any abnormalities, anything like that?
In terms of counting the votes, abnormalities, no. Nothing that struck me as unfair or illegal. Two things. Number one, yes, there was interference. There's no question that there was interference. This has been confirmed by numerous sources that there were Russian operatives basically peddling misinformation about voting machines not working correctly, about voting areas being closed, the bomb threats. I don't know where exactly those came from, but all of these things were done to suppress turnout. Yes, those things are misinformation. Yes, those things are illegal. But when it comes to actually counting the votes and making sure that every person that voted had their vote counted, that appears to be the case in every state, including every swing state. We're not at 100% yet. Wisconsin at 98%, Pennsylvania's at 99%. But remember, people who work for the AP and these major news media sources, they look at all the data and they say, look, even if Democrats get 99% of the votes that are left, they still can't make up the difference. And that's why Nevada and Arizona haven't been called officially yet. Because even though we know that Democrats can't make it up, they might only be 98% certain that, hey, all of these votes that are left might be Democratic. So they always err on the side of caution. So what we're seeing in the numbers, again, there's nothing to suggest that numbers have been manipulated or anything like that was done. Misinformation, yes. A lot of that stuff driven by X, yes, that was real. That is highly unethical. But when it comes to counting the votes, there's not really anything there to suggest that anything was flipped.
Yeah, and look, we can't ever discount the effects of that disinformation and a powerful platform like X and what Elon Musk does to a campaign like the Trump campaign. But for now, we're looking at the results. We have nothing else to base this on. Trump has got a majority of the electoral college votes. That's not going to change in any way. Now, how he did it is really interesting, because it's through the expansion of minority support for Donald Trump, ironically, that he ended up being the 47th president. It seems quite remarkable to me that it's Black male support and Hispanic support that will make the difference between a Kamala Harris presidency and what we will end up with, which is a Donald Trump presidency. Can you talk a little bit about that, about the expansion of these minority groups and in support of both Trump and the Republican Party? It's quite remarkable.
Yep, absolutely. So in my research and my analysis, I'm always looking at both sides of things. I say, okay, if Democrats have a good night, this is what's going to happen. If Republicans have a good night, this is what's going to happen. Republicans' advantage, I say Republicans, MAGA's advantage, Trump's advantage has always been his very enthusiastic base. I told people coming into the election, that Trump is at minimum going to get 47, 48% in all of these swing states because his base is that enthusiastic. His challenge was obviously we know what happened, but his challenge was finding just like a little bit more support because his base was his base. His base is 47, 48%. He will have a very hard time getting past that. So what he did is he targeted these minority groups, and he didn't overwhelmingly win a bunch of those. He basically got he squeezed an extra 2%, an extra 3% of support out of these minority groups, mostly males. Young white males, he squeezed an extra couple percent there. And 2% of a small group and 2% of a small group adds up to another 1 or 2%. And that's exactly where he's at in these blue wall states, above his base. His 48% base, if you look at his numbers, not even just the percentage, because percentages can be misleading because you're discounting the raw number of votes. In every single swing state, Trump found about 50 to 100,000 more votes. I say found as in he either turned out more voters or flipped voters who had previously voted either voted third party or voted for Kamala Harris. Or what
you say, 2 or 3%, but in reality, amongst young black men, he went from 15% in 2020 to around 30% in 24. That's doubling the support amongst young black men.
And if you break that down to the size of that demographic, that adds about 1%, give or take, to his total. But again, remember what we're talking about when we're talking about the numbers. Converting a Biden voter to a Trump voter is worth 2 because you're going from -1 to +1. And yes, he did do a little bit in terms of turning out people who didn't vote, but that was a very small contribution. So what Democrats were trying to do to combat that were 2 things. Number 1, sustaining their base, which were a lot of these African-American voters. And number 2, they were trying to squeeze Trump's numbers in the rural areas. So they were following John Fetterman's model. Some of these Democrats who did very well outside of the big cities. So their strategy was to squeeze the numbers in the rural areas and push Trump's numbers down a little bit. And it turns out Trump did better in the big cities than Democrats did in the rural areas. And those numbers are playing out across the blue wall is where I was most interested. But this started in North Carolina. So I had my own live forecast and I was following data very closely out of North Carolina. And there are these traditional African-American majority counties in North Carolina. Turnout was down there. So I saw this early in the evening, and it was one of those red flags of if turnout is down in these black communities, then that does not bode well for where Democrats needed really big turnout in places like Atlanta, Philadelphia, and Detroit.
And also in Hispanic men, we've seen he won the majority of the Hispanic vote amongst men. That is a remarkable thing for a Republican president to do. And yet it's understandable considering his focus on immigration. It's a wedge issue for Hispanic men in a different way. They don't necessarily all break towards allowing legal immigration.
Remember, so the Latino community, the Hispanic community is not a monolith because we have Cuban Americans, we have Venezuelan Americans, we have Mexican and Guatemalan Americans. Many of these second and third generation Americans, they identify more as an American than they do with their Hispanic heritage, which is a good thing. That's a wonderful cultural thing to have. But Trump and MAGA have done a very effective job. You see this in the numbers in Florida. They have been actively courting this Latino vote. They didn't start in 2024. They started in 2016, and they've been slowly building it. And they've been acquiring this group as a part of their base. And again, they're not dreaming on getting the majority of the Hispanic vote because they didn't, and they probably won't for the foreseeable future. But when they're cutting in to these traditional Democratic bases, they're raising their base from 47%, 48% to now maybe they're at 49%. In Florida, we saw 54% as their new base. They've convinced these voters that they are better economically for their interests.
Young voters as well. It seemed everyone was expecting Kamala Harris to be able to attract a much larger voter base. But overall, there seemed to be a lot of discontent amongst voters in general with the current state of the American economy. 75% of young voters believe the nation was on the wrong path. and as many as 30% wanted to overhaul government as we know it.
Yep. That's not new, but you can see maybe where it's coming from, where almost for the first time, my generation, the millennial generation, we entered the housing market at a bad time, but then it got slightly better as we got older. But now the younger generation, the generation after the millennials, they're entering the job market in order to just get by. They can barely rent. You can see where this anxiety and this discontent is coming from. They feel like no one has their interests at heart. And I can't argue with them necessarily, but for better or for worse, especially young men, they see Donald Trump going on Joe Rogan's podcast and in MMA. He's got support of the owner of MMA, and he gets a lot of media attention. He gets a lot of eyeballs from non-traditional media sources. And that raises, again, his perception when all a young person knows is that he is against illegal immigration and he is for lowering taxes, for example. He's better for their job opportunities. If that's all they know, then that's what they'll vote for. And that's okay. That's a fine thing to vote for, but we have to understand that media is changing. So traditional media is fading in importance, and this unconventional media like podcasts and authentically reaching people. That's where podcasts have an advantage over things like commercials and mainstream cable news appearances, is that people feel like you are authentically talking to them. And that has always been Trump's appeal, is that he feels as though he's authentic. It feels as though he's fighting for the average person, even though
you know the guy, you've seen him around the TV.
We know that's not Gates.
Yeah,
that is the perception.
So one last group that interestingly also increased their support for Donald Trump is Jewish voters who related to the Palestinian issue or the Gaza issue. Understandable to see where that comes from. That's significant as well, because you're looking at another minority group that sort of broke away from their traditional Democratic support, and in small numbers, that's small, but enough small numbers to give Trump the edge in some of these swing states.
Yep, that's exactly the case. And not just the edge in the swing states, by the way, but look at the traditionally blue states, New York, New Jersey, even up in the West Coast, California looks like he's going to do much better than he had traditionally done. And across the country, there's been this rightward move, and he's appealing to these previously underreached demographics where he's keeping his bases there. They haven't left him, but he's reaching slightly more voters across demographic lines. And for better or for worse, Democrat turnout basically stayed flat across the swing states, and it went down in the bluer states. So we're actually looking at a position where for the first time since 2004, Trump's going to win the popular vote, or the Republicans going to win the popular vote.
The fact that we're now seeing not just Trump as an electoral college winner, but as a popular winner, there's a lot there that suggests that Americans in the majority wanted to move towards the Trump MAGA path. And that's just where we are. And whether that's a failure of the Democratic Party to argue their message more coherently, that's quite possibly the case. You look at the two platforms, sure, the Democratic platform had a much more appealing and more sensible economic strategy for young Americans, but it wasn't obviously resonating with Hispanic groups and Hispanic men and African American men.
I'll tell you what's happening in my perception. This is just my perception. I'm a data person. I always favor hard data over person to person. I spoke to this person and they said this, but I can tell you I've talked to a lot of Hispanic voters, people in the Hispanic community. A surprising number of Hispanic voters say they support Donald Trump because he's better for their jobs. He's better for their wallets. And for a large number of voters, that's all they know. And that's all they're voting on. This isn't a dig at Donald Trump, even though you know where I stand on his policies and his platform. The same thing happened with Barack Obama. The reason he did so well in 2008, not as well in 2012, but still a pretty overwhelming victory. Voters across the swing states believed he was better for their wallets. He was better for the economy, and that's who they voted for in this election. Donald Trump has convinced enough voters of that. We're reaching this point in media where social media is overtaking traditional media. And I would argue that already has happened, where perception outweighs policy, where the perception of a candidate's position is far more important than their actual policies. Because if you listen to Trump speak on policies, he'll say he has concepts of a plan, has no plan on healthcare, but he has concepts of one. You listen to him speak on the economy, immigration. You listen to him speak on, tariffs is the best. 200% tariffs, 2000. He just throws out random numbers. He does not know what he's talking about, but that doesn't matter. The perception is he's a businessman. He tells it like it is, and he's better for the economy. When the most votes wins, perception outweighs policy.
For most people under Trump, their wallets were doing better. They were earning more money and things were going well for them. I mean, that's what they remember.
Inflation was lower. Yeah.
And that's what they stuck with. Income and wages were higher, but there was a dip during the Biden years and inflation. And that's what they remember. And it's a legitimate concern. They don't want that to continue. So they're going back to the last best thing that they thought was good. One last question about abortion. This turned out to be a issue for many voters, but not the issue for many voters. We did not see an overwhelming number of women show up just for Kamala Harris. She did well amongst women for sure, but not in the way we would have expected.
Yeah. So abortion initiatives, even in places that went overwhelmingly for Trump, in Florida, Montana, several other states that were traditionally red states, they voted. Now in Florida, they require 60% to pass. And the abortion initiative there only got 58%. But remember, Trump got 56% of the vote there. So you had a large number of people voting for Donald Trump, whose administration overturned Roe v. Wade. And a lot of those people were voting to support a policy that is similar to what Roe v. Wade had federally established. You have this disconnect, again, between perception versus policy. In Missouri, an initiative to raise the minimum wage was passed, a state that Donald Trump overwhelmingly won. We know that Republicans do not support raising the federal minimum wage, but Missouri voted to raise their. These Democratic policies are extremely popular, both on abortion, on economics. The Democratic positions are overwhelmingly popular, and if not overwhelmingly, we can at least say the majority support them, but they are not winning elections. Why? Perception over policy. That's what it comes down to. The silver lining in this, and I hope that we can come out of this with some sort of silver lining, is that Democrats will narrowly hold a few seats in the Senate, in Michigan and Wisconsin, very narrowly. Pennsylvania, probably not. Still an outside chance that they hold Pennsylvania, depending on the number of votes. And then Nevada and Arizona, narrowly. All things considered, for Democrats, it could have been worse. And there has to be a change going. And I know you haven't asked me this question yet, but there does have to be a change going forward in the messaging and in how they're reaching voters, because the strategies that they've implemented have become less effective.
It seems to me that Trump went after those voters who aren't voting, but who might be friendly towards his policies. And they got them in big numbers in the Black community, the Hispanic community. Now, those are traditional Democratic bases. You have to do the same kind of thing. You have to go into territory you're not usually welcome in, red states, and go and find those voters.
Look, they were in a very difficult position. Joe Biden had won a fairly solid victory in 2020. And he had said in 2020, he said that he planned to be a transitional candidate. And then as the election was approaching, he said, no, I'm going to run for re-election. Okay. We can agree or disagree. But as it became clear that he was not going to be able to withstand 4 more years, Democrats, their hands were tied. And Kamala Harris, to her credit, again, we can argue about the primary process. And yes, there are lots of things that Democrats should have done better on that end. But what is clear is that she played the hand that she was dealt, and I think she played it very well.
Yeah.
The problem is there was not enough time for Democrats to consolidate their support around Kamala Harris. It was a very quick turnaround, and whether another candidate would have done better hard to say. All things considered, I think she did quite well. And I do think she was extremely qualified as a candidate. She held her own in debates, and there was only so much that she could do, the Democrats could do, basically with the July turnaround of who the nominee was going to be.
Do you think there'll be another female candidate for president in the Democratic Party anytime soon?
I would say that with Hillary Clinton winning the nomination, I do think there's an appetite for a female. I think we need more females in high levels of government across the board, governors, senators, and running for president. I would say based on what happened in 2024, the challenge for a female to get that position, to get the nomination, is the bar has been raised again. And it's extremely unfair.
Yeah.
And this is the unfairness that we've been dealing with for decades,
all time, really.
Where we have this semblance of equality, and yet the standard, the bar for women is so much higher. And I see it when I worked in sports. The standard for a woman to get a high level position in any sport, the bar is so much higher. Someone that looks like me, who comes in with decent qualifications, that's good enough. It's not good enough to be good enough when you are a minority, when you're a female. You have to be exceptional.
Yeah.
That is extremely unfair, but how that attracts or deters voters is a factor. It's unfortunate, but it is a factor. We can't deny it. And how we deal with that going forward, that's more of a sociology issue than it is a car.
We need to see strong women in power in order to re-elect them into power. You know, we don't have enough of them. And until we see them, it's very difficult to take the risk in many voters' eyes. It's something that is so unknown and unfamiliar.
Clearly, Mexico just elected a female president. Female senators have just won in many cases. So things are getting better electorally. But again, there's still a perception that for a woman to achieve some high office, the bar is just so much higher.
Yeah.
The bar is just so much higher. We saw it. I saw it in Ohio. Again, Bernie Moreno versus Sherrod Brown. Sherrod Brown's credentials. Sherrod Brown obviously is a middle-aged white male, but his credentials far surpass Bernie Moreno's. Doesn't matter. Perception over policy.
I know you have to go, so I'm going to leave it there. But thanks very much, Carl Allen, for being here. The author of the book, The Polls Weren't Wrong.
There's work to be done here, but I'll tell you this. In Wisconsin and Michigan, Trump will end at about 49.5% of the vote. Kamala Harris will be just under 49%. In Pennsylvania, Trump's going to end just over 50. Kamala's going to be 48.5. This, again, we have to know what the undecideds did, but we're looking at a 1 or 2 point error in either direction. And this is just something that we have to prepare ourselves for mentally. And this time in 2022, this 1 or 2 point error, perceived or actual, favored Democrats. This time it looks like the small error may have worked against us. But if we understand that these errors are mostly random, then there's a little bit that's just out of our control. I'll be looking into the polls and whether or not they were wrong. But again, the polls were telling us that the election was going to be close in the swing states. And in my analysis, Kamala Harris's strength was in the blue wall. And based on the numbers that I've seen, Pennsylvania, she performed a little bit worse than I expected. That could be a forecast error on my part. But in Wisconsin and Michigan, remarkably close. It's hard to say with certainty until we get more data from exit polls and some post-mortem analysis. But again, we have to understand that polls can only give us so much information. When the polls are telling us the election is probably going to be close, that's really the best that we can expect.
All right, Carl Allen, thank you very much for being on the show tonight and for your help during this entire election process. And hopefully you won't be a stranger in the near future. We'll have to find other reasons to talk to you about all sorts of things, I'm sure.
Thanks again.
Have a great day.
One day, you'll tell the story of autocrats, crooks, and kings who came for our freedom. A story of citizens who stood up to tyranny and won. The people prevailed and renewed an old vow to a more perfect union. And that was just the beginning. The story continues. Narativ, where truth lives.